Hi, this is my first try to read this book. The BFG by Roald Dahl. The Witching Hour. Sophie couldn't sleep. A brilliant moonbeam was slanting through a gape in the curtains. It was shining right into her pillow. The other children in the dormitory had been asleep for hours. Sophie closed her eyes and lay quite still. She tried very hard to doze off. It was no good. The moonbeam was like a silver blade slicing through the room onto her face. The house was absolutely silent. No voices came up from downstairs. There were no steps on the floor above either. The window behind the curtain was wide open, but nobody was talking on the sidewalk outside. No cars went by on the street. Not the teeniest sound could be heard anywhere. Sophie had never heard such a silence. Perhaps, she told herself, this is what they called the witching hour. The witching hour, someone had once whispered to her, was a very special moment in the middle of the night when every child and every grown-up was in a deep, deep sleep. All the dark things came out from hiding and had the world to themselves. The moonbeam... I like that better. The moonbeam was brighter than ever on Sophie's pillow. She decided to get out of bed and close the gap in the curtains. You got punished if you were caught out of bed after lights out. Even if you said you had to go to the lavatory, it was not accepted as an excuse, and they punished you just the same. But there was no one about it. There was no one about now, and Sophie was sure of that. She reached out for her glasses. They lay on the chair beside her bed. They had steel rims and very thick lenses. She could barely see a thing without them. She put them on. Then she slipped out of bed and tiptoed over to the window. When she reached the curtains, Sophie hesitated. She longed to duck underneath them and lean out of the window to see what the world looked like now that the witching hour was at hand. She listened again. Everywhere it was deathly still. The longing to look out became so strong she couldn't resist it. Quickly, she ducked under the curtains and leaned out of the window. In the silvery moonlight, the village street she knew so well seemed completely different. The houses looked bent and crooked like houses in a fairy tale. Everything was pale and ghostly and milky white. Across the road, she could see Miss Rance's shop, where you bought buttons and wool and bits of elastic. It didn't look real. There was something dim and misty about that, too. Sophie allowed her eyes to travel further and further down the street. Suddenly she froze. There was something coming up the street on the opposite side. It was something black, something tall and black. Something very tall, very black, very thin. Who? It wasn't a human. It couldn't be. It was 4 times as tall as the tallest human. It was so tall its head was higher than the upstairs windows of the houses. Sophie opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat, like her whole body, was frozen with fright. This was the witching hour, all right. The tall black figure was coming her way. It was coming very close to the houses across the street, hiding in the shadowy places where there was no moonlight. On and on it came, nearer and nearer. It was moving in spurts. It would stop, and it would move on, and then it would stop again. What on earth was it doing? Aha! Sophie could see now what it was up to. It was stopping in the front of each house. It would stop and peer into the upstairs window of each house in the street. It actually had to bend down to peer into the upstairs window. That's how tall it was. It could not stop and peer in. Then it would slide on to the next house and stop again, peer in, and so on, all along the street. It was much closer now. Sophie could see it clearer. Looking at it carefully, she decided it had to be some kind of a person. Obviously, it was not a human, but it was definitely a person. A giant person, perhaps. Sophie stared hard across the misty moonlit street. The giant, if that's what it was wearing a long black cloak. In one hand, he was holding what looked like a very long, thin trumpet. In the other hand, he held a large suitcase. The giant had stopped now in front of Mr. and Mrs. Gooshy's house. The Gooshys had a green grocer's shop in the middle of the high street, and the family lived above the shop. The two Gooshy children slept in the upstairs front room. Sophie knew that. The giant was peering through the window into the room where Michael and Jane Gooshy were sleeping, and from across the street, Sophie watched and held her breath. She saw the giant step back a pace and put the suitcase down on the sidewalk. He bent over, opened the suitcase. He took out something out of it. It looked like a glass jar, one of those square ones with a screw top. He unscrewed the top of the jar and poured what was in it into the long trumpet thing. Sophie watched, trembling. She saw the giant straighten up again. She saw him poke the trumpet in through the open upstairs window of the room where the Gooshy children were sleeping. She saw the giant take a deep breath and whoof! He blew through the trumpet. No noise came out. It was obvious to Sophie that whatever had been in the jar had now been blown through the trumpet into the Gooshy children's bedroom. What could it be?
A little illustration going on
here. As the giant withdrew the trumpet from the window, he bent down to pick up the suitcase. He happened to turn his head and glance across the street. In the moonlight, Sophie caught a glimpse of an enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face with huge ears. The nose was as bright as a knife, and above the nose there were two bright, flashing eyes. The eyes were staring straight at Sophie. There was a fierce, devilish look about them. Sophie gave a yelp and pulled back from the window. She flew across the dormitory and jumped into her bed and hid under the blankets. There she crouched, still as a mouse, tingling all over. The snatch. Under the blankets, Sophie waited. After a minute or so, she lifted a corner of the blanket and peeped out. For the second time that night, her blood froze to ice and she wanted to scream, but no sound came out. There at the window, with the curtains pushed aside, was the enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face of the giant person staring in. The flashing black eyes were fixed on Sophie's bed. The next moment, a huge hand with pale fingers came snaking in through the window. This was followed by an arm as thick as a tree trunk, and the arm, the hand, the fingers were reaching across the room towards Sophie's bed. This time, Sophie really did scream, but only for a second, because very quickly, the huge hand clamped down over her blanket and the scream was smothered by the bedclothes. Sophie, crouching underneath the blanket, felt strong fingers grasping her. And there she was lifted up from her bed, blanket and all, and whisked out the window. If you can think of anything more terrifying than that happening to you in the middle of the night, let's hear about it. The awful thing was that Sophie knew exactly what was going on, although she couldn't see it happening. She knew that a monster, or giant, with an enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face and dangerous eyes had plucked her from her bed in the middle of the witching hour and was now carrying her out through the window smothered in a blanket. What actually happened next was this. When the giant had got Sophie outside, he arranged the blankets so that he could grasp all the four corners of it at once in one of his huge hands with Sophie imprisoned inside. In the other hand, he seized the suitcase and the long trumpet thing, and off he ran. Sophie, by squirming around inside the blanket, managed to push the top of her head through a little gap just below the giant's hand, and she stared around her.